partnerships, and it is kind of follows in the research we've been doing for a long time, in which we look at the alternatives by actually analyzing current stories of resistance and struggles. And I'm going to talk about such struggles, particularly public-public partnerships, and just to reiterate that it is not the public-private partnerships that Andres spoke in the beginning. It's not the PPPs, but we're looking really at an alternative to the PPPs and to privatization, which is public-public partnerships, or PUPs. We come actually from the assumption that the current resistance and struggles to the commercialization of public services and privatization and PPPs are at the same time experiments with new, provide at the same time some sort of experiments with new forms of public services. So in a way, we're trying to anchor visions of public services on these current struggles by considering these spaces for transformative resistance as spaces of also articulating new visions of public services, because indeed they do provide sometimes practical, but sometimes also theoretical visions of public services, and new language indeed, as Sandra also mentioned in her presentation. And this new and alternative kind of articulations are very different actually from the status quo of public services. So these different struggles provide in a way a critique of privatization, but also a critique of traditional public services, in which in many countries, public is actually equalized with state forms of ownership. Sometimes they're limited to subsets of population, to full citizens, particularly in the global south. They're often bureaucratic and hierarchical. At times, they are identified as inefficient and corrupted, and hardly designed to actually realize the creativity of labor in the process of delivering services to their fellow citizens. So in a way, these different struggles across the world help to overcome the state versus privatized public services debate. And they help actually to build on, but also bridge the northern past of public services with southern future models of participatory democracy that became particularly, manifested in Latin America during a certain historical period. And I'll go a bit deeper into some of the reasons for the backslide of these initiatives. Just going to the public services and trying to find some sort of a definition so we can get along together. They have actually risen as an alternative to privatization, but also to failed state operators, or to create limitations in the way the public services, that state-owned public services have been delivered. What is important for us to highlight here, that the public-public partnership exclude any partnership with the private sector. So that's very important to remember. And these are all definitions coming from the Public Services International Research Unit, PSIRU, under the leadership, particularly during the leadership of David Hall, who did extensive work on public-public partnerships. And their team characterized and provide two main definitions of PUPs. One is the narrow partnerships, and that is exclusively between the public utilities, or different types of public utilities, different levels, and even different countries. And we are going to call this the twinning PUPs for our discussion. And the broader partnership, public utilities and any part of the general public, that includes trade unions, NGOs, civil society, community-based organizations, but also organizations across borders. And we call this, for the purpose of our analysis, participatory PUPs. But of course, while, different forms of resistance may classify as an alternative, we need to kind of really provide some sort of a screening tool to evaluate what does really constitute some sort of an alternative or an expression of an alternative in the making. And here I am working in particular with the concept of publicness, which is developed by the municipality project under David McDonald and his colleagues, which provide really some indicators for us to understand, really have a solid concept of what does it mean public and what does it constitute publicness. And that being said, there is an understanding and a realization that despite pressure of commercialization, there has been a perseverance of elements of publicness in public services. It is also, they are also offering a possibility to operationalize this concept by providing a set of indicators, and that includes equity, participation, efficiency, quality of service, accountability, transparency, quality of workplace, sustainability, solidarity, public ethos, and transferability. So they have a very comprehensive manual actually on trying to provide a detailed description of this concept and its indicators. But the main idea is that these indicators are somehow the polar opposites of what's wrong actually with privatization, and at the same time the kind of aim to gear the public services towards completing universal societal objectives such as democracy, environmental sustainability, and human security. I want to just go through quickly some of the main indicators because it will be important for the analysis of the PUPs that we want to see, and also to unpack some sort of indicators that come from, you know, mainstream international organizations and from the government, such as efficiency, for instance, and particularly private sector efficiency that is being put forward, you know, vis-a-vis the public sector efficiency. And it is important here to highlight how this term is actually rather neutral, technical, and opaque. And what for us it is important to unpack here is to really understand that it's really a narrow framing, that it has no regard on the impact of these efficiency gains on other sectors and on society. Just to give you a few examples here, for instance, part of efficiency is to reduce the number of workers per connection. I think the World Bank guideline is 2 to 3 workers per 1,000 connections, which means you automatically cut off you know, public sector jobs, quality public sector jobs, and you actually intensify the work for the existing staff. Or for instance, they talk about cost effectiveness, and that includes introducing or increasing the fees on access to services. And clearly such concept of efficiency fails to address the societal goals of quality of life and dignity, because it is very narrowly focused really on this efficiency in terms of financial efficiency. Instead, what the team is proposing, that is working on the indicators, is the social efficiency, which includes different components: the financial efficiency of delivering services, resource efficiency, you know, losses and administration costs and so on, level of investment to ensure long-term maintenance, and then very important, the impact of efficiency gains on other sectors, workers, affordability, environment, health and safety, and quality. So I think for us, particularly for the Trinidad and Tobago context, it's really important in kind of facing the challenge and the discourse of privatization of public sector services such as water, for instance, is to really unpack these different concepts that are being put forward as if it's the final truth. And the same goes for some other important indicators. For instance, on issues of equity, it's very important to consider issues of accessibility in terms of class, location, gender, ethnicity, reliability, you know, issues of power and water shortage. And of course, here it is important to remember that countries may deal with issues of equity in different ways. And I think Andrea showed that nice cartoon in one of his slides about different way how the countries try to pursue objectives of equity, if they do pursue such as vertical equity by distributing of resources according to the needs, or horizontal equity, basic minimum package of benefits to all people. Then when it comes to the quality, of course, this becomes a bit more complex because it is indeed shaped by both cultural perceptions and market pressure. For instance, we are bombarded in the media and everywhere that bottled water is better than tap water. And it's just the way how the market has been working and in actually convincing people that that's what's quality water, what you find in the bottle. So try to reshape the quality aspect and finding indicators for this one. It's pretty challenging, but some suggestions have been to use acceptability by users as well as observances of improved quality. And I come to perhaps the most important indicator when it comes to particularly our topic, public partnerships, which is participation and accountability indicators, because it is really important to overcome, the approach of bureaucrats deciding what is actually best for the citizens. And that's really important for us to understand why we should insist on the participation of community and workers. It really enhances transparency and accountability. It empowers users. It provides additional technical and political capacities in the sector. It does strengthen those capacities. It creates a sense of ownership among citizens. And it's important to highlight here that the depth of participation is very important, because the depth of participation determines the impact on achieving the publicness kind of a vision of public services. Researchers have put forward different forms of participation, and White have put these 4 categories: nominal, instrumental, representative, and transformative, just to highlight different ways how communities and workers can be involved, sometimes in a very instrumental way, and sometimes as a token kind of participation, and ranging up to what we call transformative participation, which basically it's the empowering type of participation, because the very involvement of workers and communities in considering options and making decisions and taking collective action is actually it's an empowering exercise that allows communities then to build really greater consciousness about what are the problems and the causes of their poverty, as well as confidence in the ability to make a difference to address these very causes. And then we've seen here that despite the fact that the literature and participation, is kind of very much focused on communities and NGOs and different groups, workers have kind of been left aside. And that's for 2 reasons. One is that indeed, even the progressive kind of scholars and so on have somehow internalized that discourse that came particularly from the World Bank, that the reason for the poor quality of public service is actually public sector workers. At the same time, often public sector workers have been so much focused only on jobs and terms of employment, and have been really looking much less. And we're not talking about the last few decades, but traditionally the focus has been more on the workplace. And what we have seen in, I think, the struggles of the last decade has been particularly these transitions of struggles, not only from just fighting privatization and engaging with issues of ownership, but really moving to issues of control over the purpose of labor in public services. What does it mean to be a public sector worker? To be allowed to actually express your, to give the service and express your feeling to your fellow citizens in serving them in the process. And then the last one is sustainability indicator that I wanted to highlight. Of course, the 2 important one here are financial stability, and you mentioned the 2 previous speakers also mentioned the importance of financial sustainability, which is important, but just here to highlight that public services are not in to make profit. That's not their major purpose. The major purpose is to serve public. And I think that's an important consideration in discussing financial sustainability and, of course, environmental sustainability, all issues about nature and intensity of using resources. I mean, let's not forget, in some cases, public services are some of the major polluters by the way in which they are organized. And these are all issues that have to be taken up in analyzing the necessary transformations that have to happen in the public sector. But I want to stop shortly to the political sustainability, because I think it's particularly critical. We've seen really very critical initiatives, very powerful initiatives, backsliding. And that's because, the political sustainability of initiatives and experiments is particularly important given the context of a neoliberal, I'm not saying hegemony, but really a domination of such a discourse. And that political support for these initiatives at various levels is really critical, not only because these are new initiatives, but indeed they are under strong attack from different actors that actually are interested in making profit out of the public services. And here we are talking of the importance of a strong and supportive state. And here what we mean is not a domineering state, and a state that acts with society and not in replacement of it. And that's kind of the transformation of the state that we are looking at. And there is really a need for what this somehow the backsliding of different initiatives have shown us has been the importance of having a robust system to resist this broader context of neoliberal policies. And that only highlights the importance of transforming institutional structures, and that would be about dismantling old forms of the state with a much broader set of actors and innovative forms of governance, organizing public services to build broader-based solidarity across different actors, sectors, and various levels of services, and new and broader policy capacities and sources of finances. Indeed, to support these new initiatives, particularly because you don't want to be dependent on donors who often may have conflicting objectives actually from the objectives of public services. And these are all important. We'll see how they play out in some of the examples of public partnerships that I want to share with you. So let's look at the twinning PuPs. And I've just picked up a few examples because the time is very limited. I think I have about 10 more minutes. So we have the example of the Harrismith municipality and Rand Water Company in South Africa. It had remarkable improvements in cost recovery. So just to recall, the twinning partnerships are those in between two public utilities exclusively. So it did have remarkable improvements in cost recovery, but it did that on the back of cutting off thousands of people for non-payment. Another partnership in Malawi with the UK water facility. In this case, it led to improvement in water and sanitation services, but there was no worker involvement. In fact, workers were even dismissed for demanding higher wages and for challenging, practices of financial mismanagement. We have another partnership, the Baltic Sea Partnerships. It brought together countries from the Baltic, Sweden, Finland, and also Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. And in particular, the Tallinn Water Utility and Helsinki Water Partnership. It did strengthen the capacities of water utilities, but it also led to corporatization, which in a way paved the way for privatization and led eventually to job cuts and price increases, enormous dividend payments, and remuneration of supervisory council. So just to wrap up, when you put this partnership in the publicness framework, so we're trying to test this kind of experiments vis-a-vis the publicness framework and the indicators that I just introduced, we see that, of course, they do contribute. They improve water infrastructure and service delivery at a much lower cost, actually, than PPPs. They develop capacity for workers and their capacities, which in a way reduces the dependency on external consultants. They help public utilities to access finance, enhance financial efficiency, and improve quality. but they also have limitations, particularly in terms of participation, accountability, sustainability, and social efficiency, which shows that actually, really reforming public services and transforming public services is not merely an issue of capacities, because all what these partnerships did was actually just to build the capacities of workers, but it is fundamentally a political issue. And here we want to stop to the critical role of workers and communities participation and jump now to some examples of participatory public-public partnerships. I just brought 4 such partnerships. So one, and I also want to draw a bit of attention to the language that these partnerships use. So in the case of Bolivia and Honduras, they are called public collective partnerships. And then you have water utility and water committees and other community-based bodies were able to actually work together to expand access to water in Bolivia. And then they provided training and assistance to improve water conservation and service delivery in Honduras. In another context in Bolivia, where it was where there were massive protests against water concessions, we have the emergence of what they call public social companies. And here you have yet another kind of language that is emerging from the local context. And we have a coalition of 600 neighborhoods that came together, in a common front called FEJUVE. And ask for full transparency and bottom-up decision-making through people's participation. They also pushed for a General Assembly responsible for overall policies and election of the company boards. They also set up a control and monitoring commission to really make sure that there was collective control and corruption-free operation of public services. Another interesting example comes from Uruguay, of course, with a long history of struggle for democracy. And then here again, we have a context of environmentally damaging water waste plants and privatization plans of the government. And here we have a national water movement of bringing together trade unions, environmental and human rights NGOs, and pushing actually for a constitutional reform which included stipulations about human rights to water, direct public control, participation of citizens in all areas and steps of management, and an ecosystem approach. So we have here also the environmental aspect included. They also organized several assemblies of workers and citizens to draft this utility reform. So it wasn't done by some experts outside there. It wasn't even done from some representatives of trade unions and communities. Actually, you had several assemblies of people debating how should the reform actually be transformed. And then the union took this example to actually push for promotion of PUPs among non-commercialized utilities in the region. I will stop a bit longer to the case of Peru because it seems to be a bit more similar with the Trinidad context about what's happening with regard to the water sector. And here we have really the case of a bottom-up PUPs. The National Union of Water Workers and its local affiliate and the range of other social movements again came together in a common front, protecting water in the region of Union. It was a multi-pronged strategy. At the national level, the block legislation that promoted the liberalization and commercialization of water services. At the same time, they created broad alliances with social movements to build defensive fronts for water and to create alternative models for modernizing without privatizing. They also worked with different national and international organizations, including the PSI, to really create a common common knowledge base about the problems of the water utility. Really, they had a detailed diagnosis of the utility and how to fight the corruption, as well as options for modernizing and democratizing the utility. And in this case, they called it public participatory utility. I'm just taking this because it shows that in different countries, you have different articulations of how these are called, and they are expressions actually of how people on the ground feel, of what is their vision of how the utility should be run. when these plans kind of got blocked due to the local politics, they pushed for a partnership with a worker-run utility in Argentina and created detailed plans to reduce costs, improve maintenance, increase investment, orient service delivery to people's needs, and make the utility more democratic and accountable. And if we put now the participatory PUPs in the publicness framework, we can clearly see that it really goes beyond capacity building and knowledge and skill sharing. It creates a greater sense of ownership of services, greater accountability of managers and politicians, an improved responsiveness to community and labor needs. It overcomes resistance to reforms, where often workers are blamed for resisting the different reforms, but that's exactly because they are pushed out of any sort of participation from the discussions about such reforms. And it is when the reforms are undertaken really with the active and deep participation of workers that you have a completely different situation. It did also strengthen the leadership, planning, and coordination in service provision, and it built greater trust in between all the different actors, communities, workers, local politicians, and so on. And that was perhaps the most important element of this one, is really the extent of inclusion of community voice and priorities in the decision making. And it is really important, the insistence on this participation is particularly important because of the critical feedback that they provide. And it's due to this critical feedback that is provided that this public-public partnership can really contribute to higher quality of service, higher access, because workers and communities themselves can actually see what are the bottlenecks when it comes to quality and access, and shape social efficiency gains and greater transparency and accountability. And it does really contribute to sustainability. And the reason for that is particularly because as, let's say, environmental concerns are brought in from the communities, workers have the knowledge and expertise to address these environmental concerns of communities. The partnerships also help to build the whole process helps to build these partnerships in the operation of utilities. So in some cases, and I'll come to that a bit later, you really had even the establishment of particular structures which ensure continuous participation of workers and community. And indeed, finally, the depth of participation of workers and communities can determine the level to which democracy is actually embedded in the internal administration of the utility, which is directly related to the political sustainability. The problem I mentioned earlier, that once the political forces change, several of these initiatives have actually backslided, exactly because a main reason being really the depth of participation of workers and communities. And finally, just to highlight that although, there's different forms of partnerships, we don't have really an in-depth analysis, done particularly for analyzing and exploring and discovering this alternative ways of public services. They do provide some insights of actually the importance of such initiatives in informing the new ways of organizing public services, because indeed they empower workers and communities to imagine and articulate new visions of public services, more people-focused, community-responsive, and publicly accountable organizations. At the same time, as I mentioned a bit earlier, they lead to the establishment of new structures and processes which lead actually to critical changes in the way the public services are organized. For instance, we have cases of, particularly in the participatory budgeting schemes in Latin America, but also in India, you had budget allocations by community, social control and transparency of public utility. We have institutionalization of the participation of workers and communities, and as well setting in motion processes of collective learning, spaces for actually producing counter knowledge and counter power to the dominant discourse. The quality of participation determines at the end the ability to alter actually the structures and institutions that lead to the marginalization and exclusion of communities. And they also provide workers with the ability to politicize and expand issues of access to public services. So once you start with the public partnership in the health sector, you realize and you go to broader social determinants of health, that being water, housing, food, nutrition, and access to electricity and so on. So it's exactly the participation in communities that allows for expansion of that agenda. And for such initiatives to actually be able to survive and flourish, it is really important that they are turned really into political projects. And that's the only way how they might actually survive, by setting in motion, there's different changes in the way public services are organized, but also work in the public sector is organized.